So that's it. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Nibarto Sinha, and on behalf of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy and the Metal Foundation, I welcome you to the second episode of the Green Mandate. Vidhi is an independent policy research think tank doing legal research and to make better laws and improve governance for the public good. And we have a dedicated team at Vidhi which has been working on various issues on the environmental laws, which is now called climate ecosystems. And our major research work on is on the implementation of environmental laws, how regulatory institutes like functions, and with a mission to improve them and make them more eco-centric. And apart from the research publications and submitting reviews on new laws amendments, we also try to disseminate our research in a more easily accessible and understandable format to improve public consciousness on various aspects of the environmental law. And last year we published this Quoting the Environment, a series of documentary film movies on the implementation of landmark Supreme Court judgments on environmental conflicts, which you can also access through our website. We have been also organizing talks, discussion, film screenings with various law schools and colleges as part of our research dissemination. Going forward, we'll launch this talk series called this Green Mandate in partnership with the Equitable Foundation last month. The primary aim is to provide like a platform for an in-depth and detailed conversation with an expert to facilitate a more nuanced understanding of laws and amendments and how they affect the conservation of nature and natural resources. And today, in the second episode of Green Mandate, we will be discussing the Biological Diversity Act, which was introduced in the year 2002 with the primary objective of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of such resources, including traditional knowledge on biological resources. Now, this Biological Act is a very recent act, and we are yet to understand the more nuanced, I can have a more nuanced understanding of this act. And we have very limited published information on, like about various aspects of implementation of that. And we are indeed very fortunate to have Dr. Giridhar Kinhal, one of the India's leading experts on Biodiversity Act, as guest speaker today. He is currently the chairman of National Biodiversity, like NBS Working Group on Access and Benefit Sharing, and Goa State Biodiversity Board's Technical Committee on Access and Benefit Sharing. A retired officer from the Indian Forest Service, Madhya Pradesh cadre. He has also served as a director of Indian Institute of Forest Management, IIFM Bhopal, and as additional director of Madhya Pradesh Minor Forest Produce Cooperative Federation. He has implemented several internationally funded projects by organizations such as UNDP, ICMO, DFID for conservation of medicinal plants. And he also has a very rich academic experience apart from various administrative experience in biodiversity conservation. He holds a PhD from the prestigious Forest Research Institute on participatory forest management in India and has published more than 20 policy reports and 3 books on forest and biodiversity conservation and management. Dr. Kinhal is also a member of IUCN Specialist Group on Medicinal Plants. Sir, we are really grateful that you are here and we welcome you today. My colleague Midhu Tandon will be discussing various aspects of Biodiversity Act, and she will put questions to Dr. Kinhal. Mridu completed her master's in environmental economics from Terry University and has previously worked with organizations like Legal Institute for Forest and Environment, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, and presently she is working as a research fellow in Climate and Ecosystem Scheme at WITHI. She has also contributed to his submission on this recently introduced biological diversity amendment bill to the parliamentary committee on the bill. With this, over to you, Midhu. Thank you very much.
You have to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Devaditya, for this introduction. Sir, I again welcome you on the behalf of all WITHI team, and we are delighted to have you. So we would like to start the discussion with the history of the Biodiversity Act. As we know that the Act was promulgated to give effect to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which got ratified in 1993. And the convention is a very comprehensive piece of international law on biodiversity, given its overarching objectives on conservation of biodiversity, on sustainable use of bioresources, and most importantly, the mandate of fair and equitable benefit sharing. So given that you have a first-hand experience in terms of regulating the various provisions of the Act, and you have seen its implementation firsthand, can you perhaps share some perspectives in terms of what kind of discussions took place at the international level when the convention was being adopted? And most importantly, what was the scope of India's involvement in the same? We also looked at the fact that though the convention got adopted, came into force in 1993, the Act only came into force in 2003. So then what really happened during this period? What were the various challenges that our government felt in terms of actually getting this law in force, and also during the initial phases when the Act was just out? What was the government thinking in terms of how to implement this very comprehensive piece of legislation which has such big and benign objectives when it comes to conserving biodiversity? Over to you, sir.
First of all, good evening to everyone, and we are all into a discussion on very serious aspect of, let's say, India, and we need to take every point of it very seriously and look at what exactly needs to be done, and what we have done till today must be examined and put to scrutiny in terms of what needs to be done further. There is no intention to cause any aspersion on anyone, or why it has not happened, and some things have happened and some things have not. So there is no intention of, as I said, finding fault with someone or some agency or some entity within the country or outside. But here is a person who is retired from the service, almost 6 years gone, and has seen almost for 25 years the first of all the forestry aspects initially, and then biodiversity aspects very keenly, and was involved in the development of the whole legislation as well as later implementation processes. As you have rightly said, 92 to or 93 to 2003, what was the issue? I said, to my understanding, any law development requires huge consultation in a country of this diversity and veracity, and with almost like, if you look at per hectare species in the country, we have about 207 species per hectare. This is unheard of, and no region, geographical region, has this diversity in terms of first of all tree species, or even botanical species and zoological species. That is the biodiversity content we have to handle, and every species is important, and every species is unique to handle in terms of to attain conservation and through the sustainable use as well as sharing the benefits. I would take you back in terms of those 7-8 years which were spent after the convention. That was the time when it was, I would say, four issues were there which were helping and forcing us to have something related, some legal setup for handling the biodiversity of the country. Having said that, we have so many species per hectare. That is the importance we need to assign to that. One was the necessity was felt. These are the four things I am mentioning. What happened during those 7-8 years? Necessity, because the Indian Forest Act, which was dealing with major biodiversity in the country, especially the wild ones, was protected by block. What we were doing by reserve forest and protected forest in the Indian Forest Act was mainly related to this much forest area is reserve forest, this other remaining is protected forest, with different regimes for protection of the whole block of the forest. Without knowing completely, some of the species were known, without knowing completely the content of the overall diversity in those areas. What we assumed that time, because there were reasons also. The knowledge base was not there, the documentation was not there, the biodiversity understanding was not clear at global level as well as national level. And those were the times when Britishers in the colonial period introduced that block protection to see that content of the whole forest as much unknown, but still it is protected for eternity. That was the way it was protected by geographical limitation of reserve forest and protected forest. This was the need. When we understood from 1992, the other scenario parallelly which was getting developed was related to the IPR and the WTO regime. You all understand WTO and IPR regime, which was some kind of, let me use the word like hegemonistic technology countries in the world. They were forcing us to obtain all the technology, even third generation technology, after paying a lot of IPR related costs. But nobody realized that the sovereignty on the resources in the other part, like in India, there was no sovereignty in these. Somehow the nature has found that the species are more this side and the technology is on the other side. The technology was being charged to the underdeveloped, and the resources which were sovereign resources of the country or the region this side were being frittered away and taken away by the rich people, rich countries, without paying anything. And that was the dichotomy existing during 1992. That was the reason why Convention on Biodiversity came into existence, and that was the opportunity. I'm defining the second term now. The necessity was the block protection methodology was inefficient and not enough to handle the content of the biodiversity in this region. The major reason being the lack of documentation of the biodiversity. So documentation not being there, and the block protection assumed to be enough to protect all the content was definitely creating some kind of niche for developing a separate law for biodiversity, even including the documentation. Then, as I said, it was an opportunity after 1992. And there was parallel development in terms of people's participation in using the resources in the country. If you look at the forestry sector and even any other sector, related to natural resources, there was involvement of the people. Management came during those 90s, and social forestry was also active, and there was huge learning from the social forestry that the people could be involved in the protection and conservation of the biodiversity. This was the opportunity plank available during those years. Then huge public awareness was there related to the biodiversity happening at the global level and flowing down to any national level and state level as well. Then came the feasibility of developing a law for this kind of thing. That came through the consultative process and the awareness generated due to the participation of the local people in the management of forests through JFM, participatory forest management, and many other experiments which are done in the country. The last, I would say, the platform which got created was the acceptability because of the IPR and sovereignty, the imbroglio which was created because of the IPR from the West, the northern region, and the sovereignty related to biodiversity coming from the South. The larger context, I'm using the South as underdeveloped countries. These were the four, I would say, planks available for establishing the need for an act or a law related to the biodiversity. Is that clear, or any clarification is required on this issue?
No, sir, it's pretty clear.
Okay.
So we were looking at the various conservation laws that our nation has been blessed with. And what we saw that what sets the Biological Diversity Act apart from all the other existing laws is its strong mandate on fair and equitable benefit sharing with the communities. We also saw that the implementation of fair and equitable benefit sharing in India got an impetus only in 2014 when the Nagoya Protocol was adopted. And also coincidentally in the same year, India notified its access and benefit sharing guidelines, which gave a lot of help to the NPA, the National Biodiversity Authority, and the state biodiversity boards in order to actually regulate the process of access of biological resources and have more legal clarity in terms of imposing benefit sharing, the ways of taking approval, and other things. So, since you currently serve in a leadership position at the NBA and at the National Biodiversity Authority and the state biodiversity boards, specifically with respect to the committees which look into the aspect of access and benefit sharing, could you share with us that, in your view, what are the major challenges that our nation faces when it comes to implement this benign mandate on on benefit sharing? Also, are there, in your view, also lastly, in your view, are there any best case practices wherein benefits have actually reached the communities, which can, perhaps be treated as a model case studies for
There is
other
some
states or areas to look at?
not audible actually. There was some disruption in the voice.
Okay, so I'll repeat it. Am I audible now, sir?
It's fine.
So my questions were with respect to the fair and equitable benefit sharing mandate, which is there in the Biodiversity Act, because this is one provision which sets the Biodiversity Act apart from all other conservation laws. And as we see that it was only 2014 when the Nagoya Protocol got adopted, and India also passed its access and benefit sharing regulations, which gave a lot of more legal clarity and certainty to the National Biodiversity Authority and the state biodiversity boards on how to implement this mandate. So, given that, we just wanted to ask that, given that you are serving in a leadership position at both the national level as well as the state level, specifically on committees which look at this aspect, according to you, what are the various challenges that our nation faces when it comes to implementing this mandate? And lastly, in your view, are there any case studies wherein these benefits have perhaps reached the communities, which can be treated as a model case studies for all other areas? Over to you, sir.
Okay. Before I come to that, the specific question of answering on the case studies or any effort for equitable and fair and equitable distribution of the benefits, there was accumulation of some kind of information related to sharing of benefits from the forestry activities under the JFM and participatory forest management. I am aware because from Madhya Pradesh, I know there were two types of committees: forest protection committees and village forest committees. In the forest protection committees, we had introduced something like 10% of the total produce coming from the working in the forest was distributed amongst those committees. That kind of experience was available, limited to forestry and forest related activities in the state and other, because of the JFM resolution and JFM activities. That helped us to, because we were involved in the development of this Biodiversity Act as well. And that time it was also felt that there is need to share the benefits with the people who have communities who have kept the resource, conserved the resource and protected the resource for such long, years and ages. And in that context, that helped us. Yes, sharing is possible and sharing has to be done to see that the people get involved. Before that, I would like to highlight the four pillars of Biodiversity Act. If we understand those and interpreting anything related to four, I have talked about the planks available for enactment of this kind of an act. And now I'm talking about the four the pillars of the act. One is the biological resources themselves. One must understand, we take this and relegate that to the fourth position in general, any discussion. We have to put biological resources as the first pillar of the overall act related to Biodiversity Act. The second is the communities and the people living in and around those forest areas or the biodiversity areas where they have kept the resource intact for such a long time. Second pillar I'm talking about. Third is the users, that is the manufacturers and national and global level, the people are using for different kinds of things, which have been named here, cosmetics, medicine, and all kinds of uses. This is the third pillar. The fourth pillar is the consumers themselves, the consumers, manufacturing, and users of the biodiversity. If we remember these four pillars, and any intervention to conserve, if you look at whether it is going to abet, whether it is going to help the conservation or not, each of these levels, any intervention, if you put to that question, it will be very clear and easy to understand this intervention is going to harm the first pillar, second pillar, third pillar, fourth pillar, whichever the pillar is getting affected. Then we have to rethink whether that kind of an intervention is being used or not. Coming to the objectives of the Act, if you look at, there is only one objective. Although people talk about three objectives, the goal objective or result objective is only conservation. Right? So the other two are process objectives. One must clearly understand the objective as well as the fair and equitable distribution of the benefits. These two are process objectives to achieve or to attain the major result objective of conservation. At any point of time, any intervention in the sustainability related objective and equitable distribution of related objective, we must see that whether that is leading towards conservation or not. Only then we will be answering and will be taking help of these process objectives to attain conservation. This must be very clear to all of us. Now coming to your question of fair and equitable distribution, and what happens is majority of the people involved, major technical people and experts in the sector are talking about only fair and equitable distribution. I am asking one question: who is talking about sustainable use or sustainable harvest of the material from the natural resource? Nobody is talking about it. No interventions have been developed. I can strongly tell you that very few people talk about the sustainability aspect of the objective to attain conservation. That is where the problem is. And as we go ahead, when we discuss clause by clause of the contents of the current, we'll have to look at each of those proposed amendments as well as what is the content today in terms of whether removal of something is going to help us towards attaining the goal, or introducing certain things, whether they are going to help us move towards the conservation or not. I think this is very important to understand before we plan. I was reading through the different aspects of amendments which have been placed with the Joint Parliamentary Party, the committee which is there, and we'll have to respond to each one of those, whether they fall into one of those process goals and process objectives, and how that is going to help to attain the goal, that is conservation. Anything else you want to know at this stage, and then I move on to clause by clause or whatever is it here.
So just a follow-up question that can you perhaps tell us about certain case studies wherein the benefits have reached the communities, which can act as models in themselves, and that communities have used these
looking to the looking can I answer to that? Looking to the time we have spent with the Act and the guidelines and the veracity and the diversity we have in our country, not many examples are available. We take example of Kani tribe, one of the that leaves were harvested and there was sharing of benefits and all that. They were all, I would say, ambitious things done in the initial years. Not many real examples have come out as successful ones which can be replicated or copied elsewhere. That is the pity, in the 14, 15 years, we have been talking about the equitable benefit sharing and all that. I would go into the reasons why it has not happened. So the problem with, the three-tier structure which we have created under the Act, NBA is very good in creating international image. Language is very good. We projected ourselves, the legislation in biodiversity efforts to conserve the resources at the international level or the global level. We are rated as one amongst 2-3 countries. But then the language which is used at the global level has not been really, I would say, transcribed or translated into action at the grassroots level. We are very good at projecting ourselves and actions. The languages are good, the papers are good, the documentation is very good. But has that been translated into something which is usable at the grassroots level? This is a big question which we'll have to answer to that. Which I find, having visited many BMCs, the third tier, at the grassroots level, the people who are, as I said, one of the pillars is communities. We have protected it. Those community level, we have not really taken the mandates of the whole act then the way it is required. Although people might be talking and what they understand in terms of the international language which has been put into the documentation, it's hardly communicated at the PMC level. So that is the crisis, and that is the reason why we have not been able to create good examples of fair and equitable benefit sharing. Very few are there. They are only locally relevant. There is hardly any material for taking it as a template or an example for copying it elsewhere, adopting or adapting it elsewhere. That is the reason we have fallen behind in terms of progress in establishing our fair and equitable mechanism for transfer of benefits. That's sharing of benefits. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for these very insightful perspectives. As you mentioned quite rightly, that whenever we discuss on benefit sharing, the important aspect of engineering sustainability or having some kind of maybe a sustainable limit of extraction is always missed about, because we always, our mindset is always in terms of collecting as many benefits as we can. Sir, continuing the point that you discussed about the biodiversity management committees and how they are on ground, you had mentioned just now. Sir, since you are an expert when it comes to community-based natural resource management, and as you said that you have actually personally visited a lot of these committees and seen firsthand that what are the various issues that are there. Sir, according to you, what exactly are the reasons, that why maybe BMCs are not functioning the way they should? Is there any problem when it comes to funding them? When it comes to having adequate, maybe say, capacity building sessions? And lastly, what steps does NBA and the State Biodiversity Board in general take, when it comes to boosting the confidence of the BMC so that they are able to perform the roles and responsibilities for which they were constituted in the first place? Over to you, sir.
I would say BMCs are not just numbers. I'm unhappy to say, very constrained, that even the NGT defined them as numbers only and said in just 6 months' time you have to have BMCs everywhere. That is illogical, and let the courts be doing those kinds of things. Very, very bad that kind of a dictation came from the NGT. But anyway, in response, the bureaucracy also responded saying that we have constituted 20,000, 50,000 each of the states, declaring that we have completed the BMC constitution without going into understanding what is a BMC. That's the problem. In terms of looking at why those which have been constituted also did not. What does he say? There is a question. Attendees may type their questions. Okay, someone has to type. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is there is a lot of multiplicity of grassroots level organizations, institutions. If you look at, everyone has, even police had grassroots level, village level protection committees. Forests had its own village forest committees and under the JFM. Similarly, water committees. If you look at the participatory thing which came in 90s and continued into 2000 up to 2010 or so. So there was pressure on each of the departments to show that they are involving local people, and in that course, there are several committees with the same set of people sitting here for water. The others in the other committee, they sit for medicinal plants, in another committee they sit for forest protection, and all kinds of, the milieu is the same, the people are the same. Somewhere someone else is chairman, and we further delegated it to panchayat system, and where panchayat sarpanch is the head of the each of these committees. So many with no integration, so many with no knowledge what exactly each of these committees have to do. With, I have gone to at least 25, 30 of these BMCs, where someone is sitting as chairperson, and there are same set 7, 8 people, 10 people sitting as committee members. And when you go to the other committee, they are also the same people. The one, maybe some other person is chairing. We have totally politicized, while it is a technical committee which has to look into achieving the conservation through sustainability and sharing of benefits. The problem was it went into the political process and made into more committees conflicting with each other. Forestry, JFM is saying something. In some of the states, I am told BMCs are the same JFM committees have been converted into BMCs. Fair enough. But then the mandate is clear to the forest committees. It's fine if they act as BMCs also, but it doesn't. The higher ups in the forest department, if you look at what is happening, is at the grassroots level, integration is difficult because multiplicity and no clarity on roles of each of these. As we go up in forest department as well as biodiversity related actions, there is dichotomy in terms of domain feeling. My domain has been disrupted by the Biodiversity Act. That kind of domain feeling is there, domain synergy not being there. So there is contradiction which is already available. Someone has snatched my role, and other person without having any field functionary, like NBA does not have any field functionary. Somewhere it is done by the Ayush department, somewhere it is done through the forest department, some agency, not clear what their roles are. Many people do not understand the resource as well as the diversity. In that context, what has happened is this dichotomy of not understanding and multiplicity at the grassroots level, several committees, and the other of domain disruption at the higher levels, has really kept the Biodiversity Act in limbo and some kind of dilemma and criticism from the society for being so. That is the problem. If you go further into that, each of those roles for BMCs, people are not very clear. Let me tell you, despite this people's biodiversity register development and all kinds of activities and trainings happening at whatever levels they were happening, not much understanding has been transferred to the BMCs what their roles are, because the way numbers have been constituted, many of the states have declared some of them as BMCs, and trainings have been conducted for some of them, not all of them. There is no clarity in the purpose for which the BMCs have been constituted. That is the status as of now. I don't know whether this kind of negativity pointing out the deficiencies at this stage, when the whole amendment is with the Joint Parliamentary Committee, whether they would still consider these kinds of imbroglios which are relevant and present at the grassroots level. One must look at the action. People must look at these dichotomies and domain disruption elements immediately. I had proposed one to the NBA that I will work on functional integration of these grassroots level committees. There is clarity in terms of, to me, there is no problem at all. I know how to speak to each of these committees at the grassroots level. I have full knowledge and language for communication. The only thing we have to do is, each of these committees, there is functional clarity. Through these functional clarity, there is a need to integrate those roles and find solutions and the best possible implementation for all their activities through functional integration. This is what I want to do, and many of us can join hands to see that at the in the paper which we produced for NBA some time back. Integration of that was related to how to integrate biodiversity concerns into forestry management. That we did when I was with the NBA that time. We did a consultancy, and we gave immediate thing to be done is this functional integration of grassroots level committees and agencies, institutions, so that they do not really have any confusion. They know what is exactly their role is, and achievement is the goal of the overall is conservation of the biodiversity. That is the role we'll have to understand, which I don't know why people have not really heeded to this, and nothing is being done as of. I stop here. If you have further questions, please ask.
Sir, thank you for your very insightful points on it. I think the point that you mentioned on the need to integrate the various committees, which have very seemingly similar mandates, and the kind of confusions it creates on the ground. So, taking discussion forward from this point, you had mentioned something about the grassroots organizations in terms of the roles that they can play. Also, we were looking at in general that when it comes to implementing the provisions of the conservation legislations, various conservation legislations, civil society group as a actor in general has been very active. But so when it comes to the Biodiversity Act, and especially in regards to the various ground level challenges that you mentioned, how do you read their efforts panning in when it comes to Biodiversity Act? Do you feel that there are maybe certain ways in which the participation of the civil society can be improved when it really comes to giving more direction to how the act can be panned out on the ground?
Specifically, I would say civil society organizations and grassroots level people acting on the resource with the people must get into this, as I said, the functional integration role. I'm ready to come over anywhere and look at BMCs which are at some level of operationality. If they are not functional at all, it's not useful at all. We'll have to select some, let us say, 10 fairly better doing BMCs and try to see that this functional integration of roles can be done, is done, and we'll have to propose a process how it is to be done and all that, and that could be spread elsewhere. And what is currently happening is, if you understand, that's not my role. If someone says, some agency, some institution says, and the other agency does not own it up, and all told, the first pillar, the biodiversity in the region, gets affected because it doesn't get any shelter and knowledge transmission from the top. Whatever is provided from the NBA and the SDB really does not flow because there is no functional integration of the goals. That is the crux of, I would say, the civil societies must attempt to show, create these kinds of examples, how the functional roles. You cannot dismantle those because they have all been formed under some kind of either legislation or management systems. So discarding something would affect the functioning of the other agencies of the government. What we have to do is, you have been created for this role, the other one is created for this role. The role integration, that is functional integration, if you can attempt, that is one thing which all CSOs and NGOs must consider.
Thank you, sir.
I'm seeing a question. I'm seeing a question in the chat box. Would you just consider that? And
so we will consider all the questions together in the at the end, after we are done with our basic discussions, then we can handle it.
Okay.
So if I read your observations correctly, maybe a very collaborative or a very synergistic approach of various actors joining hands together in terms of helping out with the functional integration would help. So in your discussion with BMCs, you had mentioned a very interesting point on the biodiversity registers and the directions that the National Green Tribunal gave in terms of pushing their preparation. And we were looking at the NPA website, and currently we have more than 250,000 PBRs in the country. So we would like to know that we have so many PBRs in the country. The fact that these are such comprehensive records on biodiversity, they document the information, the knowledge that the communities have, the various management practices that they know. So when it comes to field in terms of preparing these and collating all the information, what is the scientific approach that is being followed, and most importantly, what is the scope of community involvement? Our last question on PBRs would be that how do you, as an expert when it comes to biodiversity, see the role of PBRs in terms of aiding conservation by the communities? Do you think that maybe there are certain lacunas in the existing laws which need to be looked at so as to strengthen the management of PBRs, as well as and as well as increase their contribution to research?
Okay. As far as PBR is concerned, I'm aware sometime in 2003 and 4, we had some 100 PBRs were prepared under a UNDP project in southern Indian context I'm talking about. At that point of time, the PBRs were considered as knowledge books for the people on the ground. They are not supposed to be scientific documents, as is being envisaged now, that the taxonomist goes, he gives the taxonomy name and botanical name, and we are busy in creating another imbroglio and a document for an expert document. It is better to keep it at the grassroots level. And why do we make it understandable to, let us say, a person sitting in Delhi understands a PBR in Chennai or any village in Tamil Nadu? Why should he understand? He shouldn't. What is to be understood, it is created for the people to understand that I have these resources with me, and the knowledge associated with these resources is with us. In the very language they have, it is enough to document that. I'm sorry to say, we have again moved away from this kind of scientific jargonizing and making people to move away from that. And we want those taxonomic names which hardly anybody remembers, and make it. And now the other problem which has come at that point of time, we had made this should be the property of the panchayat. That time we had said the PBRs must remain with the panchayats. If there are 4 villages, 5 villages in a particular panchayat, that document which is created in the local language must remain with the panchayat itself, so that they can refer. If someone comes for accessing something, the village and the BMCs get involved and translate that for the use, and then they are empowered to charge a fee on get the benefits out of that. But now I see EPBRs and all scientific documentation where the local level people will be mute and they will be observing what is happening, and at the end of it, the product will not be, they will not be able to access and understand. If this is my understanding of PBR current stage, what is happening. In the context, if there are 2 lakh PBRs, it's too small a thing for a country of this size. We have more than 6 lakh villages and all that, and the diversity is everywhere. In that context, what I'm trying to say is we have moved away from each of these. For example, NBA can be technical, but with good language to translate that to the local people and the SBBs. Whatever they talk about in the international level, global level, it has to be available to the SBBs in the language and to the BMCs in the language they understand. But if PBRs themselves, which are generated from the grassroots level, they become scientific documents by way of scientists getting involved in preparing those and talking about soil profile and soil content. And I have seen some of those, which is not understandable to the local people. Either you train them to make them understand those contents of that, or you leave it at that. Let that be a village document and a village common document for understanding the diversity as well as traditional knowledge associated with that. There is a dichotomy. I would not criticize that. What I am saying is the purpose for which we are preparing is lost by way of making it more scientific and science jargonizing. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, sir, certainly. So we were looking at the Act and we saw that there are certain interesting provisions with respect to creation of certain funds. We have a National Biodiversity Fund, we have a State Biodiversity Fund, and we also have a Local Biodiversity Fund. And the Act is very clear when it comes to utilizing the money that is in these funds, which is for conservation, sustainable use, and also socio-economic development of areas from where the bioresources have been accessed in the first place. So as you mentioned that you have visited the BMCs firsthand, you're also there, you also have leadership positions at the National Biodiversity Authority and the State Biodiversity Board. So can you share some perspectives that how these funds are actually being managed? What are the kind of utilizations that happen? And most importantly, as you had mentioned earlier, that BMCs, that though India has constituted a lot of BMCs, still their understanding of the roles and responsibilities is a bit shaky. But they have this huge responsibility to manage the local biodiversity fund, which also requires a lot of protocols in terms of accounting procedures, in terms of preparation of reports. So how do you look at their capacities? And lastly, perhaps if the authority and the state biodiversity boards take any sort of capacity building sessions so that committees are more aware of what they are required to do. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, as I said, PBRs being the base, They are the documents for the local people. One. Second, if you look at what can be generated in terms of contribution towards all the three funds. NBA cannot fund itself. It cannot create any national level fund. It has to come from the resource which is at the grassroots level. Again, SBBs have some proportion which has to be there at the state level fund creation. Similarly, the BMCs. You look at BMCs have been authorized to collect collection fees. There is a clause which talks about when they decide from an area they are managing, how much can be harvested of a particular species. Again, the sustainability is the issue. They have to decide for, let us say, if there are 100 hectare of a particular resource with them for management. From that 100 hectare, before the harvest begins for the next season, they have to declare from here only this much quantity can be harvested. You understand what I'm saying? People must be clear on saying that in this 100 hectare of area which is with us, let us say amla or embylia, whatever species you talk about, only this much quantity is to be harvested, and anybody coming for accessing that resource must limit to removal of that quantity only. For that, BMC has been authorized to charge some collection fee. You are aware of that, right? So that collection fee helps us to introduce the sustainability concept. If beforehand they declare saying that it is 100 quintals or 100 kgs which can come from 100 hectares, that 100 kg declared quantity cannot be surpassed by the accessing agency. So 100 kgs, if 10 rupees is the fee collected, it has nothing to do with the price of the material right now. It is only allowing a sustainability level to be established. Nobody has understood this. I am very clear about it. None of the, because we were there when the act was being framed and the bill was developed. At that point of time, this fee introduction at the BMC level was very clearly to establish sustainability. Because nobody wants to touch that issue. Sustainability is a myth, and sustainability is a difficult thing to use as process for attaining conservation. Nobody wants to get in there. A forester is talking about, it is possible to say from this area only this much quantity can be harvested. And that knowledge has to go to the BMC. Based on that, they must say only up to this, not even this quantity, up to this quantity must be harvested from that area so that the sustainability norm is adhered to. So nobody does it. It is left to the agency which is given the access. They take in the name of 50 kgs, they take away 100 kgs. They will have paid the money for only 50 kgs. That is the kind of unsustainability which we are. And this generates, if you have this fee generation thing every year, some material is being harvested, this generates funds at the BMC level. For example, if they harvest, as I said, 1 quintal, which has to fetch some 5,000 rupees as fees, 5,000 gets deposited. Nowhere I have found anything of this sort done. So that is the pity, that each of the clauses, each of those elements which have been inbuilt into the Act and the rules of Biodiversity Act, they have not been really translated at the grassroots level in the context of the process goals we have. One is equitable sharing when the money has come in. This fee money related to how much is collected from this is not actually the benefit sharing. It is only to see that the resource is sustainably removed. That nobody understands. Nobody even goes into how much is the capacity of the area to, on a particular species, how much can be removed. And that is the quantity which the BMC has to mandate and say, beyond this, first of all, we don't allow. If we allow, and if we allow only that much quantity, we will charge this fee from here. This helps to create document of how much has been removed year after year, and also to see the fund gets generated at the local level without even looking at the fair and equitable sharing, which is the latest. Is that clear? Someone has to, even this is a role for CSO. If they can take some 10 BMCs and see whether this kind of a thing has been done. This is another role for the CSO and NGOs. I stop at this. I'll look for another question.
So I just have another question, because I can see that there is a common theme in all your answers. That is that whenever there is a discussion on the monetary aspect, be it in terms of collection fee, be it in terms of the biodiversity funds, or be it in terms of equitable benefit sharing, you always are talking about the fact that nobody is, pivoting the discussion towards the sustainability aspect, that what is the minimum limit till which, you can allow the resource to be extracted. So since you had again mentioned earlier that there are a lot of challenges on the ground in terms of actually implementing the act, but at the same time sustainability is the most important criteria, and it's important to keep in mind whenever we have any kind of discussion in terms of the Biodiversity Act. So given that you are a forest, that you have been in the forest conservation field as an IFS officer for so long, so in your view, how can this sustainability limit be set on the ground? Because as you had mentioned in the context of collection of fees, it's very important to be clear that what is my minimum threshold. So how can these minimum thresholds be actually be created in practice?
You have come to the real crux, as this was my PhD on 6 species of different products from each of those species. One was fruit, leaf, bark, root, all kinds of products obtainable from any medicinal plant species in the country. All the 6 species we studied and said, as of now, whatever is going on, we call it as business as usual. Has that business as usual which is going on? That was one of the treatments in my research. Business as usual, has it really reduced the species in terms of content and potential for harvest? So people have the knowledge. If we continue to harvest the way we are harvesting, earlier some 5 years back, the resource used to be very close to our house. Now we have to walk 5 to 6 kilometers to get that much quantity. That is the answer. The business as usual is not really sustainable, right? So many of the species, they also mentioned saying that we used to get, we are not getting. That unsustainability has already been there. And all those species which are currently under harvest, we have to test the BAU to the different knowledge systems, introducing even the scientific knowledge of how much a plant can produce, how much a species can produce, all kinds of, the production related variabilities could be introduced and develop from the BAU the quantity which is possible to be removed on a sustainable basis without hurting the species potential. That we did in 6 species, and we subjected that to even scientific rigor, statistical analysis, and we found that the people's knowledge, which otherwise, if it gets implemented, it will be sustainable. The current BAU is because of nobody's ownership, nobody owns up, nobody tells how much is to be harvested. Once the access is given to the manufacturer or the middleman, they extract maximum and they take permission for 10 species and harvest 15 species, 20 species at their levels, whatever they want. There is no check on the total quantity being produced. The business as usual also gets obliterated, and to such an extent that the species becomes extinct and the villagers lose the species. In that context, there is an urgency to understand each of the species. I tell you one of the cases which came up when I was chair in that NBA. They were asking for 10,000 kgs of one of the companies from Switzerland. They were asking for 10,000 kgs of a gum karaya. I said, I am aware as forester, it is found only in 5 states in the country. Right? In those 5 states, we addressed our letters when I was the chairperson, addressed the letters to the PCCFs of those states. Please tell us how much is the quantity which is obtainable from your state. No replies, because there is no documentation of that kind. No quantification. I'm not alleging anyone because the systems do not provide. Earlier, we had the transit pass system in forest department where every forest produce used to be, it used to move with the transit pass only. That means some documentation was happening at the grassroots level, how much has moved out of. Sometime back in, let us say in 90s or 90, end of 20th century, they did away with the transit pass system. There were allegations that it leads to corruption and all kinds. The human incapacities or human, I would say, inefficiencies were put onto the resource to, in a way, lose the resource. What we said, DP system is leading to corruption, people are making money, but the requirement was how to document the quantity being removed. Even now, we do not have, majority of the states do not have any transit pass system or any documentation. I would say there is a solution here. The BMCs can start with BAU level, the business as usual level from the area they manage. So let us say it is 10 quintals, we can start with. That when 10 quintal removal, if it is monitored and adhered to, what is happening to the resource can be tested in the next year. This way, if you do it for 3 years, the BAU gets tested and a different level gets established. saying that this is not BAU cannot continue. It has to be at 80%, 70% of the BAU, which was happening 3 years back. And that is the harvestable limit which can sustain the resource. This kind of outlook, this kind of experimentation, nowhere it is done. Even some of the scientists who have done some sustainability studies, what they have done is 25% of a particular produce in a year can be harvested. Let's say in Amla itself, they said, oh, you can harvest 75% and leave 25%. Okay, how will you translate this into action? 75% for a particular person who is harvesting, he harvests 75%. The next person who comes again harvests 75%. This way, 75% has no meaning because it's an open treasure. So what we have to do is that has to be regulated by time period, total material coming out of it. That means there is a documentation required, either TP or whatever you call it as. It could be BMC, it could be forest departments, Beat Guard or whosoever it is. He creates a document that from this area, this much has gone out on a particular species. This lack of information is hurting intervention, the process objective, that is sustainability intervention. Saying that from each of the species, you have the scientific studies saying that from a plant you can harvest 75% and leave 25%. These are impracticable and it cannot be translated into action at the grassroots level in an open treasure system. I hope I have answered that question.
Yes, sir, certainly. And sir, thank you so much for taking us, through your journey as a PhD student and then as an IFS officer, and then at the capacity of a regulator.
My PhD was when I was conservator of forest.
Okay. Thank you, sir. It's indeed interesting to know that how you have battled this aspect of having a very clear understanding, the need of having a very clear understanding of sustainability when it comes to implementation of the conservation legislations, and that sadly, I think the discussions and the implementation aspect has been a bit maybe disconnected with this very important, crucial element of sustainable harvest. Sir, it's already 5 and 5 was the outer limit for the event. Sir, but since the discussion is being very enriching, would it be possible if we can extend our talk for some time?
I think so. Another 15 minutes, we can come to the crux of whatever is currently being discussed. Yeah.
Okay. So we wanted some understanding on the concept of biodiversity heritage sites. When we were looking at the guidelines of the National Biodiversity Authority, they said that why we are having heritage sites in the first place is to expand the protected area network of India. But then if we look at the existing protected areas, that is mostly national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, we see that they are based on a very exclusionary, prohibitory model of conservation. But on the other hand, the heritage sites are more inclusive when it comes to management by communities and ensuring that they have access to the resources which they have been historically using. So we were also looking at the official data, the current data in terms of how many heritage sites we have in India. And we saw that 22 have been notified. So we just had 2 quick questions. Firstly, in order to have maybe more nuanced understanding of the concept of heritage sites, and then why, though the Act is some 20 years old, but we still have some 22 heritage sites only. Over to you, sir.
First, more is not always better. That we must keep in mind. Just because it is 22, let us not be panicking about it. If let me say the Devaravanas and the Devara Kadu concepts in southern India, if you look at God areas declared as protected by the community people, they still are there without getting the tag of heritage sites and all. When they, on the contrary, if they get into some kind of systems and under a particular legal sanction, that it becomes a heritage site, or number is more or less, I would say let's not get into that. If the such areas exist and they are under protection from the community, let them continue as they are. And I have seen at least 10 of those in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. The communities are doing very good job in terms of protecting those. Whether we get them declared as, although the Act talks about it, but it is only a matter of changing the nomenclature or changing the position in terms of something coming under the legal umbrella, or something remains as it is, still it is getting protection from the local terms of. I know in forestry itself, in Harda division of Madhya Pradesh, the people protected bamboos like anything. I tell you, once I was moving in the forest area, there was a flag which was put there. And surprisingly, that belonged to none. That flag was not belonging to any political party or any Bhagwan or any god or whatever. It was some flag created by the villagers saying that the people should not harvest beyond that flag any bamboo this year. In that particular year, they were restricting by putting that flag that people should not move beyond this for harvesting bamboo. That means they had their own legislation in terms of community legislation to see that the people do not harvest. That means the sustainability concept as well as the heritage and the content of the whole biodiversity unit was being maintained, and there was no problem at all. In that context, I would say numbers, we should not be as we are happy with having BMCs. How many? 2 lakh BMCs or whatever. More than that, declared NGT mandate. All these are no use at all. And that way, my request to you would be that don't highlight that as an issue. Heritage sites, if they feel that there is a need, something is not getting protected from by the involvement of the local people, we should be concerned that they are declared here. And what happens is once we declare something under the Act, there is demand for money. Money must flow. There is a lot of politicizing. Who should do that? And all kinds of. Otherwise, communities do a very fairly good job in protecting these kinds of heritage sites, unnamed as well. That's my quick answer to this. And people are attached with the resource as if they are their own family members or something like
that. Thank you, sir. Sir, before turning our attention to the amendments that were proposed recently to the Biodiversity Act, we just wanted maybe a very quick insight from you in terms of the offences and the penalties provision in the Biodiversity Act. We had been reading a few case laws and we saw that sometimes companies, resist compliance with the provisions of excess benefit sharing in terms of taking prior approval and, the consequent sharing of benefits. But at the same time, the Act even gives powers to the authority as well as the state biodiversity boards to impose fines, as well as even allow for imprisonment up to 5 years. So given the problem that we have and the strong provisions that are there in the law, we were interested in getting to know that are there any experiences or any past where you have witnessed that the authority and the state biodiversity boards have actually exercised these powers in ensuring compliance from the companies? And then secondly, when they actually use their powers, what are the kind of challenges they face from the ones that have to comply with the Act?
Again, you are going to the other aspect, which otherwise I would say seeking permission, obtaining permission to harvest something, complying with the laws, positive aspects of the law to attain sustainability, and later the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. But the other end is if someone does not do, what is the way out? So not many examples, but I know because we are not very clear on how to use these. In Madhya Pradesh itself, one of the State Biodiversity Board CEOs, I remember, he had sent a letter saying that all coal fields, because they are removing coal, which is again a biodiversity resource, they must pay 2% as the total. If 2% of coal harvest in the country is paid to the SBBs, I would say they become different governments. Government of India would be poorer than coal harvested material, 2% being paid to the biodiversity board. That was, I was upset when this issue was raised. And coal is no biodiversity. Ultimately, we declared that coal is not a living biodiversity, and nothing is conserved by putting a living, some kind of charge of 2%, 3% on the coal harvested from by the coal fields. So in that context, there is no clarity how to implement. But best way is to see that the permission is sought. There are good examples now being done at the NBA. The process is quite good. Although there are some less understood areas, but the process as of now, the Form 1, Form 2, which have been put together in the last 10 years or so, it's fairly good, and there is time limit also to each of those applicants. They get yes or no in 1 month's time or 30, 40 days time. That is a good process of moving positively into the process, rather than saying if you don't do, I will punish you. that doesn't help. Although I would say these bodies like manufacturers and pharmaceuticals and all that, they are accessible and they are controlled by, they are regulated by as many laws as we have in the country. It should be possible to restrain them from going into that. But nobody has, let us say, not having any sustainable levels for each of the species. Who is going to be punished? There's no answer, right? So why you don't have any fair and equitable sharing? It's not there. There is a lot of discussion going on. Not having sustainable levels of harvest from each of those areas. Who has been put to some question? Nobody has put. Because the biological resources as the first pillar of the whole act, they cannot speak for themselves. They are mute entities. And the people who have to protect them and remove them in a sustainable way, they do not have the levels to ascertain saying that you can't remove more than this. So in that context, the second, let us say, process objective, which talks about sustainability for the species, who has been charge sheeted? Let me ask this question. Is there any level declared by the states? No. I told you about the 10,000 kgs of gum to be harvested. No response, because they don't have the details. They don't have the how many trees can produce so much of 10,000 kgs of gum? Nobody knows. So not doing, let us say, not sharing the benefits with the people if it is an offense. Similarly, not having sustainable levels of harvest also is an offense. So we tend to get to the money rather than the resource. Money is an output. Resource is our domain in terms of one of the pillars of the act. Nobody is looking at it. That is my concern, actually. Hope I have given you the imbroglio in the system. Nobody talks about the sustainability. I have been hammering, and I have, the highest of my voice talked everywhere. Nobody tries to put together. I said whatever money has been accumulated in terms of access and benefit sharing at the NBA, put 50% of that into developing major species. The sustainability levels must be ascertained for each of the PMC areas. Or let us say at the state level, how much can be removed of a particular species. Nobody does this. That's the pity. And nobody concentrates because it's more problematic. Nobody gets into there. Easier one, like for example, if 1 crore, the Red Sanders has given some 300 crores, how much is to be distributed to whom? They are very happy to do that. See, Red Sanders is another species which is harvested. It is only the stolen material which is seized and sold. Because it is a banned species, right? It is, again, it is banned under Forest Act. It is banned under all international laws. It cannot be exported. CITES regulation is there, but whatever they harvest, they once in a while they conduct auctions and sell it, and the sold material they again permit it to be taken away. Japan takes material from Japan. These are the things which CSO organization like yours must raise and see that why this illegally harvested thing is regularized every time, and that means you are already sending a signal to those Johnnies who cut the trees. You keep cutting, we'll catch you, maybe 1 or 2 will be punished, but the material being so costly and so expensive, it gets sold anywhere and it becomes valid. You have to give transit pass. When I was in Kathmandu, I came to know that 2 trucks of Red Sanders have been caught in Kathmandu because they do not have Red Sanders. They said, what is this? Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, sorry to cut you in between. It's just that we have certain questions by the audience as well.
Okay.
So I'm very sorry, sir. It was a very interesting discussion. I'm really sorry. I apologize to cut you in between. But sir, we just wanted to quickly turn our attention to the amendments, the recent amendments that were passed by the Parliament, and we looked at quite a lot of them. And what caught our attention was firstly this whole distinction between codified and non-codified traditional knowledge. Firstly, codified traditional knowledge is not defined in the Act. It was not defined, is not even defined in the bill. But then there are certain exemptions being offered when it comes to this type of knowledge. So we wanted to know firstly that what is the concept of this knowledge? Does NBA or SBB really have a distinction in these terms? And most importantly, in your view, if these amendments get passed, what will be the possible implications in terms of regulating biological resources, in terms of IPRs, in terms of protection of knowledge?
Okay. As far as codified knowledge is concerned, when I was chairing that, the committee at the NBA level, all codified means the Ayurvedic scriptures and the Ayurvedic, pharmacopoeias, all knowledge available there is considered as codified and it is public domain. It cannot be considered as one of the norms for fixing the benefit sharing, enhancement. But anything related knowledge to particular species at the local level itself, it is not written, it is only passed down from generation to generation. It need not be defined in the act, it is known. And why would any country get the definition from us, or want to get definition from us on traditional knowledge? We define this way. For example, you must be aware of TKDL, traditional knowledge digital library. You are aware of? So there they have clearly used the definition which they have used, documented those knowledge streams available which are non-codified. They will not document an Ayurvedic knowledge. Only those knowledge systems, knowledge faculties available at the local level, they are not documented, they are not in a way codified. That's the word being used. And our concern, I read the details sent by your agency, your center, that we have not defined, but how do we restrict? There is no need for anything to be defined when it is clearly understood in terms of, we did that in state level as well as national level. SBBs were clear and national level also we were clear. Anything written, documented, available in the public domain is not codified, non-codified knowledge. Traditional knowledge is non-codified. Only then we used to say this is known to a particular person or set of people, set of community at the village level. That is non-codified and that requires to be guaranteed in terms of some benefit to flow to those people. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. So there was another interesting amendment which basically had recurring effects on other amendments. This was with respect to tweaking the scope of subsection 2 of section 3. Earlier we had this clause on companies that are registered in India, but they have foreign participation, be it share capital or be it in terms of management. Now the bill is coming up to replace this. The bill is coming up with this clause on companies that are registered or incorporated in India, but they are foreign controlled. So we were wondering that because a set of companies has now been explicitly removed from the scope of the Act, it will definitely leave a lot of it will definitely have certain maybe implications in terms of regulation of bioresources. What will now happen to these entities which are now left from the ambit of the Act? And that what are going to be the final effects when it comes to implementing the Act?
That's a very good question in terms of what happens after this classification of the agencies under 3.2 is done the way it is articulated here. Let me say the foreign element as of now, if you look at how much portion of the biodiversity accessed from the Indian region is used by those companies. And even I am aware, some of the Indian companies also, they were saying why we are being asked to share benefits. That's not a correct thing. How much of what is going into their manufacturing processes or their commercial activities must be looked at and say you are also responsible for accessing this resource here and you have to share the benefits with the local people. That should be the mandate, not going into what is the structure under the Companies Act, which one is MNC, which one is registered where. What I say is whosoever is the user of the resource, getting commercial benefits out of the resource must be charged with the equitable sharing element. Otherwise, what will happen is you will see 10 years down the line, all of those shift to those kind of companies, and there will not be any company which comes into the ambit of the Biodiversity Act. Should we actually encourage that kind of a thing? Any new company coming into will be of that kind and they will keep accessing the resource, not paying anything to the local people for their efforts. So what we have to say is whosoever it is, even the local communities manufacturing, the local agencies manufacturing the Ayurvedic medicines, they cannot be exempt because they are extracting the material from accessing the resource from the natural resource. So in that context, I would say that our mandate should be to see that the material is whosoever is the user must be giving back to the local people for sharing the benefits with the local. If we define that way, MNC not registered, where it is registered, where it is, the word used here is, what is that? They call it as registered, something registered or whatever they use it. Anyway, what I'm saying is never get into their existence, in what way they are existing. It is better to know what are you taking. You are taking material from us, you have to share the benefits. For commercial activity, all those which otherwise, for example, Neem Hakims at the local level, medical person at the Nati Vaidyas in Karnataka, all those people are exempt. They can use it for medicine, dispensing medicine at the local level. Nobody is, arguing with them and you should share the benefits. No, what we are saying is, if some commercial activity is happening because of our resource being extracted and accessed from the natural biodiversity elements from the natural areas, they must pay the equitable share of benefits. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir, certainly does. Sir, we can now move on to the questions that our keen audience has posted. Sir, Ankita Khodia is interested that how effective is the Forest Department when it comes to implementing the Biodiversity Act? Do they have the capacity to train the collectors to ensure sustainable collection, storage, marketing, and that whether the civil society groups have enough funding on this? Can there be a comprehensive business model?
Okay, the question needs to be re-articulated in one sense that CSOs and the agencies, smaller agencies, can create examples. They can take and say models can be developed. But you go to some of the states like Madhya Pradesh, where I served, we have a federation there, Non-Timber Forest Products Federation, which is doing fairly good job in terms of harvesting and involving local people. Through the local people, the cooperative societies which are there, there are gaps, but they are competent enough to do that. And it is the same forest department at the grassroots level. The DFO is the same. He is called the managing director at the grassroots level. So in that context, a structure has been created. It is doing a fairly good job. As far as sustainability is concerned, there is much more to be done. There's no doubt about it. But then there is a system available. There is an understanding of the resource, clarity on in terms of how many species, and almost like 50 to 60% of the knowledge related to species diversity, etc., exists. And there is a need to, and many of the states have visited Madhya Pradesh and tried to emulate and adopt certain things from there, and it is happening. As far as resource dynamics is concerned, no other department can understand better than that. But as far as CSOs and NGOs are concerned, they can create models for implementation and articulate with the agencies for rearranging themselves or structuring their management patterns. That's what it is.
Okay, sir, we have two quick questions. One is from Aditya Darayan, who in fact has some experience in terms of constituting BMCs on the ground. And he wants to know your views in terms of the fact that, as you mentioned, that there are some 2 lakh plus BMCs, but the fact that how can they really be strengthened? How can the PBR process be strengthened? How can they have more clarity in terms of their roles, responsibilities?
On the PBR thing, I would suggest, although it may be difficult because they have moved a lot into converting that into a huge, I would say, technical and sound document, science input document, which would take a lot of time to prepare, because we do not have that kind of taxonomies, we do not have those kinds of technical people, although some of the states have really taken universities and departments and various other technical people into and developed those technical teams to develop those PBRs in the area. The task being so huge, we shouldn't have gone into too perfect a document to develop a perfect document at the grassroots level. Whatever as proletariat knowledge was available, I'm using the word proletariat, that is the community level knowledge, to know that I possess this and our people have knowledge about these species, should have been the approach, and that would have happened at a faster pace. That is related to the PBR. I don't know whether that is possible to be reverted. If I were to be doing that, I would have done that. And this is what we did in 100 PBRs were developed in 2004 in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and 3-4 other states. We showed how it has to be done. It was in the local language. And at the end of the process, we would deposit those things with a function, with a good function organized at the panchayat level, handed over to the panchayat, the village level panchayat, saying that this is your document, you must keep it in your custody. Any access related of any biodiversity from this document must be with your permission, BMC's permission and all that. So that's what we did. But ultimately, now you see it has gone into some kind of ePBR, which is accessible by anyone and everyone. This is huge, I would not call it as distortion, but moved from what was understood as PBR and what has been created now. That's what. And as far as number of BMCs and how to train them and all that, it's a gigantic task. But it should be left to the, I would say, the SBBs. SBBs must create those kinds of documentation, those kinds of material for helping the BMCs. The first thing we have to do is the functional integration and clarity on roles for those kind of institutions at the grassroots.
Thank you, sir, for these perspectives. So we have one last question from Barisha, who's interested in knowing that in the current bill, the Ayush practitioners have been excluded from the scope of Section 7, which talks about the power of SBBs to regulate the collection of biological resources. She's interested in knowing that what were perhaps the intention or the various reasons to keep these practitioners outside the excess benefit sharing requirement. And lastly, what could be the possible implication of this amendment in terms of sustainability, in terms of conservation, especially because this is one sector which is heavily dependent on medicinal plants.
So that's a very good question in one sense, that the Ayush people, I take them as like Ayurvedic doctors, and they use products for dispensation and dispensing the medicine and treating the people. In any case, the products would have come from some manufacturing sector, right? They would not dispense, and they normally, earlier the Ayurvedic doctors used to get the material from the forest or from wild areas and prepare the medicine, customized medicine at their own level. I think that kind of Ayurvedic medication and medicine development has gone by. And currently what you see is they have across the counter, they prescribe certain things and they get it. But all that produce which is produced and provided at the counters has already passed through this legislation in terms of accessing. Someone accesses, someone transports, and someone brings it to some kind of Ayurvedic product manufacturing. So all that process has already been adopted, and Ayush people can as well. Why should they be paying anything for, they are not really making any, access of the resources from the wild areas or whatever. The biodiversity is not being accessed by them, is my understanding. If they are doing this kind of customized medicine production at their own level, we have exempted the local hakims and all that. It may be fair enough because they are very few. I don't see that those kinds of Ayurvedic doctors still practicing that way. Does that answer our question?
Yes, sir, it certainly does answer question. So we would wrap this discussion now. It was indeed a very enriching discussion, and we really like to thank you to spare your valuable time.
One thing I would like to add before we just close the discussion, the value-added products terminology which is used was creating a lot of problem when I was almost for 18 months I was there as heading that chairman of that committee. For example, if some science development or some research which is I used to call it as rice cooker imbroglio. If some rice variety is used to develop a cooker, that also was being taken as biodiversity used to develop the cooker, which is unfair. These kinds of things should not be done. We are stretching too far the provisions of the Act. If cooker developer uses rice and we say he is using biodiversity to produce his product, that is cooker or whatever, these kinds of instruments and any gadgets, those kinds of applications used to come for IPR permission, the patenting and all that. I said, stop this. I would not encourage these kinds of applications. To the extent that we wrote to people saying that any biodiversity used to develop some, how much is the temperature at which the rice gets cooked? That is where the cooker is developed. That's the way the pressure and all that, the balancing thing they do. And we start saying you are using rice to lose. Those kinds of things should be stopped. And we must look at, as I said, these 4 pillars I have talked about. If any of our action is affecting any of these 4 pillars, we must look back and see how that needs to be amended. If that action is done before we really introduce those kinds of interventions, fairly we can implement the act. This is my last statement. It is possible. This is an act which has been developed through huge consultations at the grassroots level. People have really reacted and added and deleted many things. And now is the time when the amendments are being considered. Only one thing, the value added product, which is not there in the amendments, also it is not mentioned here. And as far as the member secretary thing which is coming, again, dichotomy being created at the same institution, so 2 powers in one under one roof, it will create, humbug. So in that context, I hope the value added product thing must be very well defined and articulated to see that biodiversity does not get affected. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Definitely something a lot to think upon, and we again would like to appreciate you taking your valuable time to give us a very informative and a very intriguing talk. So we also would like to apologize that we have really exceeded our time limit, and again for bearing with us. Sir, at the end, I would also like to thank all our participants and tell them that this talk is being screened on a lot of other social media platforms, so they can always access it. And also, if they have any follow-up questions, if it is possible for you to maybe, if it is possible for you to like directly, take with them through maybe email or something.
You have my
yes.
if you plan to take up anything related to functional integration, which is my some kind of lifetime ambition to do that functional integration thing at the grassroots level, maintaining the integrity of all those agencies, institutions created at the grassroots level, I would like to be at least looking at what is going to happen on those. I would be very keen to work on that integration thing if you want to take it up. Any questions, definitely they can address it on email, or my phone number is there. WhatsApp questions I can entertain, and within my limits of understanding, I can respond.
So, okay. At the end, I would like to thank my colleagues, Devaditya, Utkarsh, and Tarika Jain for helping us in organizing this event, and they also played a very important role in our submissions to the Biodiversity Act. And I'm very grateful to the communications team for organizing this talk and to ensure that the talk goes smoothly. Lastly, sincere thanks to our keen and wonderful audience. That's it from our side, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dev. Thank you, Dev, for bringing me in, and I hope I was able to quench your curiosities as we asked in one of the webinars we were together elsewhere. And you mentioned it to me that I'm keen to have you on one of the internal discussions, and I hope it was useful. Even if it was not, when we have wasted 1.5 hours.
No, sir, it is really.
Okay, thanks a lot. Be in touch.
Thank you.
Anything we can